welcome the host of Epic this week, Mr. Nick Redfern.
Hi, this is Nick Redfern, and I'm very pleased to be the guest host on tonight's episode of Epic Voyages, which, of course, if you don't know, is the radio show of the Extraordinary Phenomena Investigations Council, which you can find at www.epicvoyages.com. And I'm very pleased to have a great guest on this evening, a very good friend of mine and fellow seeker of all things strange, weird, and monstrous, and who I know you're going to be fascinated by, who's got a lot of stories to tell about his own very personal investigations into strange creatures, not just in the United States, but overseas as well. And that's Ken Gerhard. And before I introduce Ken, I'll obviously give Ken time to introduce himself as well. But I just wanted to say that I've been friends with Ken for probably about 6-7 years now. And aside from being a good friend, what really impresses me about Ken is that he's not just like an armchair researcher. He actually gets out into the field, does the investigations, tracks down the witnesses, and applies scientific methods to determining the truth about things like the Chupacabra, Bigfoot, etc. And, I think that's one of the most important things when it comes to these phenomena that fall under the banner of cryptozoology, whether it's Bigfoot, lake monsters, etc. We need people who are enthusiastic and can get out there and do the investigations. And that's certainly what Ken's done. And he's put the results together of his work into 3 very good books. And so I think tonight, we're going to have a great conversation covering all manner of work and Ken's history, etc. So with that said, Ken, welcome to the show.
Good evening, Nick. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you tonight.
Yeah, it seems we've been running into each other left, right, and centre the last few months, one place or another. So.
Yeah, well, thank you also for the very kind words. Much appreciated as always, and of course I have a great mutual respect for you. So it's it's always a good time talking about this stuff.
All right, cool. Well, I mean, I think, a lot of people obviously are interested in, the sort of work you've done. But one of the things that I'm sure people would also like to be, very interested to know about is actually how you got involved in the whole banner, if you like, of cryptozoology and, what prompted your interest to not just read about it, but actually sort of get involved at an interactive level and actually get out there and look for these things.
Well, I think, first of all, like all young boys, I think I was quite fascinated with monsters and weird creatures and things. But of course, when I saw my very first TV program about Bigfoot, it was very exciting to me. I was quite enthralled and fascinated. And at that time, it was the 1970s, of course. Bigfoot was on the news quite a bit, and there were a number of good TV shows on, like The Old In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy and stuff. Legend of Boggy Creek, of course, was a movie that came out that impacted myself as well as some other Bigfoot researchers. So it was something I've always been interested in my whole life, but certainly never planned on pursuing it as a career. I was very fortunate also growing up because my mother was a travel agent, and she was very adventurous and actually wanted me to be an archaeologist. So she flew me all over the world to these great ruins in Greece and South America and different places. But I was always most fascinated in the legendary animals or, legendary beasts, things like the abominable snowman and the Loch Ness Monster. And fortunately, I was able to visit Loch Ness like you did as a youth. And that had quite an impact on me as well. So, but growing up, I pursued a music career and I did some other things with my life. But I'd say about 10 years ago, I became actively involved with some Bigfoot researchers here in Texas, primarily Chester Moore Jr., who you kind of introduced us in a way, Bobby Hamilton and people like that. And they took me out into the field and I started experiencing things that were quite fascinating to me. So it became a real passion of mine at that point. And, basically I just put all my energy into pursuing investigations of all these different cryptids or cryptozoological creatures.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. And now, as I mentioned in the introduction, you are one of these people who sort of recognizes the importance and deep value of actually getting out into the field, in terms of the internet's a great resource tool, but there's no real alternative to getting out and looking for these things. And I know in your first book, Monsters Are Real, you focus quite deeply on some of the investigations you did. Was it in Guatemala, I think? Was it?
Belize.
I'm sorry, Belize. Okay.
Yeah, I didn't
could
quite
you
make
talk
it
a
to
little bit
Guatemala.
about this? Some of the, a lot of people, I'm sure, listening to the show will be aware of the work, the sightings and the folklore of things like Bigfoot and Ogopogo and the Loch Ness Monster. They may be far less well aware of, what's going on in Belize. But I remember reading your book, and there's some sort of pretty profound stories in there of very strange creatures that were seen actually in that particular country.
Yeah, well, obviously, Bigfoot or sightings of Bigfoot-like creatures, it seems to be a global phenomenon. It's certainly not limited to the U.S. or the Himalayas or anywhere else, but most people aren't aware of the fact that there are accounts of weird hominids, hairy hominid types of beings extending down into Central and South America. When I first read Ivan Sanderson's classic book, Abominable Snowman: Legend Come to Life, that was a kind of an eye-opener for me, because he did a really good job of detailing these accounts. And he had spent some time down in Belize, which at that time was known as British Honduras, very tiny country down there south of Mexico. And there were apparently two types of hominids that people had reported. One was called the Sisamite, which is very similar to the North American Sasquatch, sort of big and hairy and muscular, very tall and scary. And then there was a second type known as the Duende, according to Sanderson, and this was described as about 3 to 5 feet tall, with a flat yellowish face, hairy and upright, but certainly not human. And, to my knowledge, no one had really conducted an extensive investigation into the Duende. Once Sanderson had mentioned it, it was kind of left as a cold case. So several years ago, I decided to invest my time and money into traveling down to Belize 2 times to conduct an investigation in the areas where the Duende had been reported. And this is in the Maya Mountains, which is in the interior of the country, a very remote and beautiful area, primarily mountainous jungles. And I did, of course, speak to many locals who had different, interpretations of the Duende. Many of them are of Maya descent, and they have a very supernatural view of the Duende, a very spiritual view. Other people did feel that it was some type of, ape or very large monkey, some type of primate. And I actually I found some very interesting tracks, which of course are inconclusive. They're unfortunately were not that distinct, but they did look very primate-like. Didn't seem to match with any of the other animals in the area, according to the locals that I spoke to. So, but yeah, there certainly is a lot of potential down, I think, throughout Central America and into South America, of things like Bigfoot. When you take into account the very, dense habitat, great, food supplies and so forth. So it was pretty exciting stuff.
All right, cool. And did you kind of get the feeling that, I think a lot of people assume that our world sort of very much traveled and explored. In terms of Belize, are there a lot of sort of very underexplored areas where conceivably these creatures could exist and really not be found unless someone's going looking for them?
Oh, well, absolutely. And I think the more that I travel or have an opportunity to travel around the world, I really see for myself how much of the Earth's habitat is still, very vast, unexplored, uninhabited areas. I think somewhere like half to 3/4 of the Earth's land surface is still considered wilderness area. That is area of land that has really not been affected by man. You have jungles and swamps, mountains, forests, deserts, tundra. All these vast areas, millions of square miles. And, for example, when I was about 9 or 10 years old, my family was camping along the Amazon River in South America, and I got to see firsthand really just, this immense area of jungle that, was very unexplored and could literally be inhabited by anything. So I think that's one of the things that really adds a lot of credence and a lot of hope to cryptozoologists like myself, is that we have these areas that could potentially hide some really remarkable creatures.
Okay, cool. And I guess sort of the next big thing you kind of did after your Monsters Are Real book was Big Bird, which was this study of, as the title suggests, sort of unknown, huge flying wing creatures seen around the United States, literally going back for many, many years, and that seem to fall into two categories, sort of the giant winged bird type creatures and the pterodactyl type creatures. And, correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess talking to you as both a good friend and a colleague, this seems to be sort of one of your real areas of passion. Would that be correct?
Oh, absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about, the background to this phenomenon and some of the cases that you feel are, particularly fascinating, incredible, and what you feel might be going on?
Well, certainly, and as you mentioned, big birds are near and dear to my heart, and of course, I'm not referring to the Sesame Street character, but rather the reports of just enormous birds. And when we say big birds, we're talking about things with wingspans anywhere from 12 to 15 to 25 or 30 feet across. I mean, truly monstrous birds. And these are often linked to the Native American legends of thunderbirds, which many Native American tribes depicted on totems and petroglyphs and so forth. Their belief in these great eagles that could basically block out the sun and often at times would snatch up villagers. But there are modern reports of truly enormous birds, primarily in North America. One of the things I think that spurned my interest here in Texas was that we had a great wealth or history of these types of reports, dating back to primarily the 1970s, when down in the Rio Grande Valley, south of where I live now, there were literally dozens and dozens of accounts that were making the local newspapers and news channels in a very short period of time. People were seemingly seeing something wherever they looked. But as far as some of the accounts that are quite notable, of course, you have the famous encounter known as the Lawndale incident, and this occurred in 1977 in the state of Illinois, when a young boy named Marlon Lowe was snatched up by a large bird that was flying over, as he was playing outside. This was apparently eyewitnessed by his mother as well as some other neighbors. Scientists quickly tried to dismiss the account as a misinterpretation of perhaps a turkey vulture or something else. Well, anyone that knows anything about zoology and birds in particular know that vultures are not built to, snatch things off the ground. They are carrion eaters and scavengers, and they just don't have very strong talons. So whatever picked up Marlon Lowe and carried him for a few feet before he was able to wrestle free was something quite extraordinary. Shortly thereafter, there were many other sightings around the state of Illinois. There are other states like Pennsylvania that have a rich tradition or history of these enormous birds, particularly in the north central mountains. And quite recently, I've been getting a lot of reports from the state of Alaska and from some of the Rocky Mountain states, which actually makes a lot of sense in terms of thinking about something like an enormous vulture or eagle type of bird. That would be an ideal habitat for something along those lines. So, you have the Native American legends, and then you have the modern accounts. The one frustrating thing about the big bird mystery is that we really don't have any physical evidence. There are no feathers, giant feathers, or eggs, or nests, or droppings, or any of the things that you might expect to have if these enormous birds were really flying around all the time.
Okay. And, one of the things that I sort of picked up on quickly from reading your Big Bird book is the fact that there's a clear differentiation between these large bird-like animals and creatures that sound remarkably and suspiciously like modern-day pterodactyls, whereas the big birds are classically sort of feathery big birds. They seem very different. Can you talk about the differentiations, and are there sort of geographical factors involved? Are they more aggressive, less aggressive? How you differentiate between the big birds and these sort of leathery pterodactyl type entities, if you like.
Well, that's a great point. One of the truly befuddling things about the Big Bird mystery is it seems to be kind of a mishmash of different types of descriptions, although we do get a lot of similar descriptions in terms of, the large black vulture-looking birds, but also many people have reported and described things that look very prehistoric, like a pterodactyl. Typically they'll describe the skin as quite leathery and devoid of feathers, the bony crest on top of the head, or in some cases a long reptilian tail dragging behind. And these eyewitnesses have been quite adamant that in fact was what they saw, was a flying reptile that, presumably went extinct 60 million years ago. But what's interesting geographically is that the range and distribution of those types of reports are just as vast as those of the other types of big birds. I mean, we have pterodactyl types of reports from here in South Texas, up the West Coast in California. The Midwest has quite a few, states like Ohio and Michigan. So that, they seem to be everywhere, which is, really, it's really not a strong representation of what we might be experiencing here, because, looking at things in terms of a zoology, something like a pterodactyl, if it could actually exist and avoid detection, something that had avoided an extinction event, we would expect it to, perhaps be found in a very remote area of the Congo in Africa, or, somewhere in Asia. But I mean, the notion of something like that flying over the state of Michigan without more people seeing it or reporting it, I mean, that is quite remarkable. However, there are a lot of consistencies in the reports as far as at least the descriptions go. So, I mean, it kind of opens up a whole can of worms as far as, are we dealing with a psychological phenomenon? Is it something, interdimensional that, many people, including yourself, have kind of, postulated about. So, but yeah, we have those, and then we also have the reports of the the large wing humanoid types of things, like the the Mothman and the Owlman and so forth. So they all kind of get lumped together, it seems.
Well, actually, that sort of brought me to the next point I was going to bring up, based on the fact that we're both we both live in Texas. I guess sort of predating Mothman by a good sort of 12, 13 years was the sort of infamous Houston Batman, which I'm pretty sure a lot of people will have no idea about. They'll be along the lines of, what on earth's the Houston Batman? But in many respects, it is sort of like a proto-Mothman type story, isn't it? With a lot of kind of uncanny parallels. Can you talk about that one? Because I know it's one you've investigated due to the fact that, you didn't live exactly too far away from where all the action kicked off, did you really? So.
No, actually, that is a very famous case for people that are interested in Fortean phenomenon. It was actually John Keel, as far as I know, who probably brought the case into notoriety when he was, involved in the Mothman research and so forth. But back in June of 1953, in an area known as the Heights, which is, kind of a near-town area in Houston, one hot summer night, there were 3 eyewitnesses who were apparently sitting out on the porch talking when they suddenly saw this shadowy figure cross the lawn, and looking up into a pecan tree, they noticed a very unusual figure perched on a large branch. They described it as standing about 6.5 feet tall, with a man-like form, and apparently dressed in a black paratrooper costume, including a helmet and knee-length boots. But the most intriguing aspect of this figure was that it appeared to have bat-like wings attached to its back. And, according to the eyewitnesses who, later reported it to police and also were featured in a local newspaper article, the being swayed back and forth for several minutes. They also detected a sort of a dull illumination or glow that it seemed to emit, kind of a grayish, yellowish glow. And eventually it simply faded out. Whatever it was just vanished into thin air. But pretty weird case. Obviously Keel felt there might be a connection to Mothman and other types of winged humanoid creatures. I attempted to retrace, the location where the sighting actually took place when you and I were working on the Monsters of Texas book. But unfortunately, there's been a lot of development in that area, and I think that, that particular residence is now gone. And it's interesting that, other apparitions similar to the Houston Batman have been reported or described in other cities. For example, here in San Antonio, we received a report similar to the Houston Batman that occurred, about 2 years ago, and very near an air base here in town. So, it's very weird stuff. It almost, certainly not traditional cryptozoology, but perhaps more, zoo form phenomenon or Fortean zoology, or however you want to look at it. But a very strange case.
Well, that's actually sort of leads into the sort of the last question I had on that section was, I mean, after all the research you've done and written an entire book on these weird flying creatures, I mean, do you see them as sort of solely flesh and blood, that we just haven't caught them? Are they paranormal, or is it somewhere in between? I mean, have you been able to sort of come to a personal conclusion, or is it just sort of too weird to conclude anything, really?
Well, that's the kind of question, Nick, that, if you asked me on Monday and Wednesday and Friday, I might have a different answer than Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, it's always changing. It's a very fluid phenomenon. Obviously in the case of something like the big birds, I mean, we do have fossil forms, specifically the teratorns, which were these enormous condor-like birds that lived during the Ice Age that had a wingspan 14 to 25 feet across. So that's a very interesting link there that we have to these modern reports, because at least in those cases, you have an animal at one time that was scientifically, we know existed. And so then the theory would be that perhaps a small pocket of these birds have lived on in some remote area, and we see them on occasion. But in terms of something like the Houston Batman or pterodactyls, you really have to go outside the box for any type of explanation that's, going to make any type of sense in a scientific way. So, those types of cases, I think, for example, the Mothman, which I was up in Point Pleasant, West Virginia earlier this year doing a Mothman investigation. And, the sense I got after talking to several people and investigating the locations was that, perhaps something like Mothman would be best construed as a type of negative energy, something that's been created and perhaps has physical attributes when it needs to. But certainly if you take into account, the curse and many of the conspiracy theories and some of the things that John Keel experienced, it really does seem like more of a supernatural or paranormal type of phenomenon.
Okay. And you mentioned Monsters of Texas book, but before we get to that, one of the areas I really wanted to sort of get your views on, because it's a fascinating case, and what makes it more fascinating is that you're probably one of the few people who've actually personally investigated it, and that's the Beast of Gévaudan. And I wonder if you could talk, give some information about this creature, which is sort of, in many respects, like very unique and weird, and what the story was and how you came to get involved in it, and your sort of thoughts and conclusions on it today.
Well, the Beast of Gévaudan was, it was quite an honor, first of all, to be involved in an investigation of that caliber. I mean, this is a truly famous mystery, not just in cryptozoology, but throughout Europe and France in particular. It's basically an iconic case. Here you have these accounts of these killings, and according to documented records, hundreds of attacks and perhaps 100 deaths were attributed to this creature that was described as a werewolf. This was back in the 1760s in a very remote area of southern France. It became a national crisis to the extent that King Louis XV dispatched soldiers and professional hunters and pretty much pulled out all the stops in trying to put an end to the killings because it was creating such panic. The descriptions were typically of a wolf-like creature, but much larger, often described as large as a small calf. Of course, very ferocious. I was involved in that investigation, for a show called The Real Wolfman, which appeared on the History Channel a couple years ago. we basically we had the luxury of conducting quite an extensive investigation. I spoke to many experts on the beast. I was, admitted to the Museum of Natural History, where we spoke to a taxidermist there. I worked very closely with a French cryptozoologist named Jean-Jacques Barlois, who had, worked on the beast cases for years and years. So it was a pretty extensive investigation, and but of course the frustrating thing, Nick, is that it was also a very cold case. I mean, you're talking about a series of events that happened 250 years ago. Mm-hmm. So you're reading these rusty old documents, and you're wondering, is this fictitious? I mean, were there other ulterior motives in play? Of course, you have, conspiracy theories involving the church and the rulership of the time. There's also the notion that perhaps these killings were actually, carried out by some type of serial killer. So, I mean, there are a lot of different aspects to the case. Ultimately, I don't want to give away the ending to the show in case anyone hasn't seen it. But I've come to the conclusion personally that I believe there was actually an animal involved, sort of a very unusual animal, considering the circumstances, that was involved in some of these killings. And I think from there, it just received a very romantic sort of status. Once people retold the tale, and perhaps some of the deaths were exaggerated and so forth. Mm-hmm. So,